on today's High Court ruling that mining billionaire Andrew Forrest and his iron ore company, Fortescue Metals Group, did not mislead investors. It's come as a huge relief for Fortescue shareholders after a tumultuous time of late, and for Mr Forrest, who faced possible disqualification as a company director. And joining us now to explain the case and the ruling is Sally Scott, a partner at Hall and Wilcox Lawyers. Sally, thanks for joining us. And can you give a brief description of this case, given that it's effectively been 8 years in the making?
Sure. This case concerns a transaction in 2004 and a statement made by Fortescue to the market and to the public and to investors in relation to whether or not the transaction was binding. The statement said that the transaction with the Chinese companies was binding and it related to an infrastructure project. In fact, it was just the framework, the initial framework agreement. There were many more details to be sorted out and negotiated. So you can see in that context, ASIC alleged that the statement that this contract was binding was misleading and breached the company's disclosure obligations, and that Forrest had breached his director's duties in relation to that statement.
And so today's ruling that Mr Forrest and Fortescue did not mislead investors, many did suspect it would go the other way, did they not?
That's right. The full federal court held unanimously, so 3 judges unanimously held that Forrest and Fortescue had done the wrong thing. They had misled the investors and they had breached their continuous disclosure obligations. So that was a fairly strong decision, unanimous in the full federal court. The High Court has gone completely the other way and unanimously held that they weren't responsible. And the way they did it was really to look at, it's almost, if you say, technicality, by looking at what was actually meant or what was conveyed and represented to the market by the words used. The words used were that the contract was binding. And the High Court looked at, well, does that mean, on the one hand, as ASIC alleged, that the contract would be legally enforceable in the court, or does it simply mean that Forrest and Fortescue intended for it to be binding and the Chinese parties intended it to be binding? And the High Court decided it was the latter interpretation, that all that was conveyed to investors by this statement that the contract was binding was that the parties intended it to be binding. So that's quite surprising when you look at the statement that was actually said. A fair interpretation would be that investors would read that statement as the deal had been done and that this transaction was going ahead, that it wasn't subject to a lot more negotiation. So they were lucky in that sense, and it was surprising that the High Court made the decision that it did.
Indeed, and finally, Sally, what do you think it will mean for investor confidence in regard to these continuous disclosure laws, given this judgment today?
I don't think it's going to change things significantly. We've had a string of High Court cases where the High Court's gone the other way, held directors responsible for misleading statements, most recently James Hardie. And interestingly, with this particular decision, if the court had found, which it didn't, but if the court had found that Forrest had been, and Fortescue had been misleading, had been reckless, had been dishonest when saying that their contract was binding, then they wouldn't have got away with it. So investors will take some comfort in knowing that directors can't be dishonest, can't be reckless in relation to these statements, but they may well question some of them. But keep in mind that directors need to be extra vigilant in relation to statements. We've seen many cases where they've gone down. Directors in particular, they need to be very careful that if they're going to make statements, as many are required to, statements to market and statements to the public, that they don't mislead. They need to be very wary of what the interpretation is to the market. What will they interpret this statement to be?
Indeed. Sally Scott from Hall and Wilcox Lawyers, thank you.
Thank you.
It's 12 Eastern. This is Newsday on Sky News on the Sport Now with Paul Gregg.